On a chilly spring morning in New York City, Maddie Parker, a 72-year-old woman with silver hair and a gentle demeanor, stepped cautiously onto the bustling streets. Despite the clear sky above, the air felt cold, unforgivingly cold, as though winter had lingered too long. At her age, every step mattered more than it once had. The familiar ache of arthritis settled into her joints, turning each sidewalk crack and uneven stone into a careful challenge. She had long since accepted that her body no longer moved with the ease it once did, but that did not stop her from moving forward. Maddie had always been a woman of resilience. She'd weathered countless storms in her life, each one shaping her into the woman she was today. Stoic yet kind, silent yet profound. She wore the lines on her face like badges of honor, each wrinkle a testament to the years lived with dignity, grace, and an unwavering strength that only comes with time. Today, though, she had one simple goal: to find a moment of warmth, a brief respite from the cold, the hustle, and the grind of city life. As she moved through the crowded streets, her sharp eyes scanned the storefronts, half blinded by the chill wind and the increasing pollen that swirled in the air. It was just past noon, and the typical rush of midday commuters made the sidewalks feel even narrower than usual. The usual sounds of honking horns and rushing footsteps filled her ears, but today they felt distant, like the world was too busy to notice a woman like her. Maddie paused for a moment, looking up at the building on the corner. There it was, a new café. Sleek glass windows framed the entrance, and bright ribbons hanging like decorations for a celebration proclaimed its grand opening. The floral arrangements that flanked the door were a burst of color, an oasis amidst the gray of the city. For a brief moment, Maddie allowed herself to admire the beauty of the scene. But more than the bright flowers or the extravagant design, it was the promise of warmth that called to her. Warmth not just from the cold, but from the world itself, which sometimes felt too harsh for someone of her age and condition. With a small sigh, Maddie adjusted her light jacket, pulling it tighter around her thin frame, as though she could ward off the cold with a simple gesture. She checked the time again. 12:50 p.m. Her medication would need to be taken promptly at 1 p.m., and there would be just enough time for a quick rest. She made the decision in that instant, her heart hopeful for what might be a quiet, peaceful moment in an otherwise bustling world. She reached for the door of the café, its polished brass handle gleaming in the soft light, and pushed it open. Inside, the world was calmer. The space was a study in modern minimalism. Clean lines, soft hues of beige and gray, and the faint scent of freshly ground coffee and pastries. The quiet hum of voices was punctuated by the sound of jazz playing softly in the background. Most of the patrons were professionals from the surrounding offices, dressed in crisp suits, their eyes fixed on laptops or papers spread out on the tables in front of them. It felt like a place where business was done, where deals were made over cups of steaming coffee and quiet conversation. Maddie made her way to the back of the cafe, choosing a booth by the window, far from the hustle of the other patrons. She settled into the plush leather seat, her body sighing in relief as she shrugged off her jacket and placed it neatly beside her. The cool air from outside had followed her in, and for a moment she closed her eyes, taking in the quiet. The world seemed distant here, just for a moment. As she took a deep breath, a wave of warmth passed through her, and she allowed herself to relax. But even in this moment of comfort, the weight of her daily life, the struggle with her Addison's disease, the careful timing of her medication, the quiet battle to maintain some semblance of normalcy, never fully left her. She had been living with a condition for years, and it had taught her patience, discipline, and the importance of small routine. But it also left her with a sense of fragility, the constant reminder that her body could betray her at any moment. Yet, in this moment, there was peace. For a few minutes, Maddie allowed herself to feel like anyone else, just another person enjoying a warm drink on a cold day, a small victory in a life filled with invisible battles. Maddie had barely settled into her booth when the cafe's calm, soothing atmosphere was pierced by an unexpected presence. The distant murmur of conversations, the clinking of porcelain cups, and the soft hum of jazz were suddenly drowned out by the weight of a single, cold gaze. It was as if the air around her had thickened, the temperature suddenly dropping even lower. The man who had approached her table moved with purpose, his steps quick and deliberate, but it was the expression on his face that caught her attention first. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and cold, like the type of person who saw the world as something to be controlled, not experienced. He was tall, dressed in a crisp white shirt and a dark tie that hung stiffly around his neck. There was no warmth in his demeanor, no kindness in his posture. His whole body seemed to exude an arrogance that felt out of place in a place meant for quiet respite. Maddie's eyes met his, and for a moment she wondered if he had mistaken her for someone else. Or perhaps he had simply come over to check if she needed anything. But no. The words that came next shattered that illusion instantly. "What do you think you're doing here, ma'am?" His voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it, sharp and biting, like the wind outside. His gaze swept over her, slow and deliberate, lingering on every detail of her appearance, as if she were an object under evaluation. Maddie blinked, taken aback by the hostility in his voice, the venom that dripped from each syllable. She had spent a lifetime learning how to face adversity with grace, how to rise above the prejudices and injustices that often came her way, but the rawness of this man's words stung in a way that felt different. His eyes, cold and dismissive, pierced through her like a knife. She could feel her heart quicken, but she fought to keep her composure. "I'm just here to have a snack and take my medication," she said softly, trying to maintain the calm that had settled over her since she walked into the café. The words felt like a shield, an attempt to reassert control over her body and mind. She had every right to be there. Her presence here was as valid as anyone else's. The man's lips curled into a cruel, mocking smile. "You're not welcome here," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "You don't belong in this kind of place." The words hung heavy in the air, and for a brief, unbearable moment, Maddie's mind went blank. Was she hearing this correctly? This was a public place, a café, not some exclusive club or private venue. Was it really happening again, after all these years? A lifetime of experiences, battles fought silently in her heart, and here she was, still fighting for the most basic of human decency. "I beg your pardon," Maddie said, her voice trembling only slightly as she raised her head high. "I'm a paying customer, just like anyone else here." The man's smile only widened as he leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing, his face a mask of cruelty. "You really think you belong here?" he asked, his voice low and threatening. "This place isn't for people like you. We don't cater to your kind." Maddie felt the sting of his words, but she refused to let them break her. She had heard such insults before, but each time it felt like a small part of her heart cracked open. She wasn't just being insulted because of her appearance or her age. No, this was something deeper, something more insidious. This was about her very existence, about being treated as less than human. "I don't understand why you're speaking to me like this," Maddie replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'm not asking for anything special, just a moment of rest and to take my medicine. I've done nothing wrong." The man's lip curled even further as he sneered down at her. "You're nothing but an inconvenience here, old woman. You don't fit the image we're trying to maintain. We cater to professionals, not people like you." The words hit harder than any physical blow could have. The quiet cafe, which had promised warmth and sanctuary, suddenly felt suffocating. Maddie's body grew stiff, a mix of anger, hurt, and disbelief swirling inside her. She had faced prejudice before, of course, but the raw malice of this encounter was something different. This was not just about race or age. This was about power. Who had it and who didn't? She knew she was going to need the ingenuity here. "I'd like to speak to your manager, please," Maddie said, her voice barely above a whisper but her gaze unwavering. The man's eyes flickered with amusement. He took a step back, giving her a look that said everything she needed to know. "You're speaking to him," he said, tapping his name tag with a mocking flourish. "James Whitaker, at your service. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have important matters to attend to." Maddie's heart sank. The cruelty wasn't just in his words. It was in the way he dismissed her, as if she were nothing more than an unwanted nuisance. The establishment she had hoped to find peace in had turned into a battleground, and she was left to navigate it alone. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her pill bottle on the table, the act of preparing for her medication suddenly feeling like an act of defiance. She was a customer here. She had every right to be. But James Whitaker had made it clear. She wasn't welcome. The air in the cafe grew thick with tension, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. Maddie's heart pounded in her chest, the pulse in her ears drowning out the quiet murmur of voices from the other patrons. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the unrelenting cruelty of James Whitaker's words still ringing in her ears. But before she could fully process the depth of the situation, an unsettling shift in the energy around her made her stomach drop. The young waitress, carrying Maddie's hot water and pastry with careful hands, moved toward her table. For a brief, fleeting moment, Maddie thought she might be able to escape the nightmare that had unfolded. Perhaps this moment of peace, this small, fleeting act of kindness from the waitress, would restore some sense of normalcy. But as the waitress neared, James Whitaker's expression twisted, and a sudden wave of malice took over. In one fluid motion, Whitaker reached out and grabbed the tray from the waitress's hands, his fingers curling around the edges with a force that made Maddie's breath catch in her throat. The young woman stumbled, confusion and shock clear in her eyes, as she watched Whitaker swipe the tray away from her. "Sir, the waitress began, but her words were drowned out by Whitaker's sharp interruption. "Get out of here," he barked, his voice a mixture of cruelty and impatience. The waitress froze, her face pale, unsure whether to protest or comply. But before she could say another word, Whitaker turned his gaze back to Maddie. And then, in an act that seemed almost calculated in its malevolence, Whitaker raised the tray high and flung it with a swift motion. The hot water arced through the air, the liquid splashing violently across Maddie's face and arms. Time seemed to slow as she instinctively raised her hands in an attempt to shield herself, but it was too late. The searing pain of the scalding liquid hit her skin like fire, a jolt of agony that made her cry out involuntarily. Her body tensed, and the once soothing atmosphere of the cafe was suddenly filled with the sounds of her shock, her pain, and the gasps of the patrons who watched in stunned silence. Her arms burned, the skin reddening in angry blotches as the hot water soaked into her sweater. The tart, her sweet, comforting tart, followed the water, spinning through the air and landing with a sickening splash across her lap, the berry filling, staining her clothes. Her favorite pink sweater ruined. The sugary scent of the fruit was replaced by the sharp, bitter tang of humiliation. Maddie sat there for a long moment, stunned, the world spinning around her as the pain began to radiate from her skin. She felt the heat of the water and the coldness of the stares from every patron in the cafe, but worse than the pain, worse than the burns, was the feeling of being seen as nothing more than an object of disdain, an obstacle in the way of their polished professional lives. She was being treated like she didn't belong. The air around her grew heavy, suffocating in its silence, broken only by the sound of Whitaker's mocking voice. "Oh my, how clumsy of me," he said, feigning concern, in a voice so dripping with insincerity it made Maddie's stomach churn. His eyes glinted with amusement as he looked down at her, his expression twisted in mock sympathy. "I'm terribly sorry, ma'am. It seems I've spilled my drink. How careless." The words felt like a slap in the face, each one a layer of insult piled on top of the other. The pain from the hot water on her skin was nothing compared to the hurt that came with the realization that this man had deliberately tried to break her, to reduce her to nothing more than a stain, a shadow in his carefully curated space. "I need a medical kit," Maddie managed to say, her voice thin with pain and shock. She was struggling to keep herself composed, but the dizziness was already setting in as the burn on her skin intensified. The heat on her arms was overwhelming, and she could feel her heart rate increasing, her breath shallow. But Whitaker's response was like a punch to the gut. He didn't offer help, didn't even seem to care. "A medical kit for a little spill?" he sneered. "Don't be so dramatic, old woman. If you need to clean up, there's a restroom down the hall." Maddie's hands trembled as she looked down at her ruined sweater, at the pill bottle that had been soaked by the water, the label beginning to peel away as the water seeped into the plastic. Her lifeline, her carefully budgeted medication, the very thing that kept her alive, was in danger of being destroyed. Fighting back the tears that threatened to spill, Maddie stood shakily, her body moving like it was weighted down by the heaviness of the moment. She could feel the stares of the other patrons, the silent judgment in the air, but she ignored them. She wasn't going to let them see her broken, not when she still had a little fight left. But her steps were slow, each one heavy with the burden of this fresh humiliation. As she made her way toward the restroom, the echoes of her own pain were drowned out by the low murmurs of the cafe's patrons, most of whom had quickly turned their attention back to their own affairs. To them, this was just another moment of discomfort in a world that rarely cared. But to Maddie, it was a moment that would stay with her forever. Maddie's legs wobbled beneath her as she staggered toward the restroom, her body still shaking from the violent incident that had just unfolded in front of her. Her arms throbbed, each movement sending sharp stabs of pain through her scorched skin. The scalding water had left her with angry red welts, as though the cafe itself had burned her with its disdain. She could feel the eyes of the patrons on her, their silent judgments piercing through her like needles, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her collapse under the weight of it all. The door to the restroom loomed ahead of her, a faint promise of solitude, of some form of escape from the chaos outside. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling as she pushed the door open. As the door swung shut behind her, a brief moment of quiet enveloped her, and she leaned back against it, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. The sting from the burns on her arms was sharp, but it was the emotional ache that cut the deepest. She had known prejudice before. She had felt the sharp sting of being disregarded, rejected, and belittled because of her race, her age, and her condition, but this was something different. This was cruelty, pure and unfiltered. She had been humiliated, her dignity stripped away in front of an audience that had remained silent, unwilling to stand up for what was right. Maddie squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, trying to steady her breathing, but the wave of dizziness that followed threatened to knock her off balance. Her body, already weakened by the hot water, the burns, and the emotional toll, was beginning to betray her. The sharp, pounding headache that began to settle in her temples was a warning sign, one she had come to know all too well. The familiar weakness in her limbs, the dizzying sensation that spun her world, were symptoms of the Addison's disease that had been her constant companion for years. She pulled herself toward the sink, her body feeling heavier with each step, as though the weight of her experience in the cafe had settled into her bones. The mirror above the sink reflected a woman she barely recognized. Her normally neat appearance had been destroyed. Her pink sweater, now stained with berry filling and water, clung to her skin, damp and uncomfortable. Her hair, usually neatly styled, was out of place, strands sticking to her face from the sweat and tears she was fighting to hold back. Her eyes were wide with shock, the deep lines around her eyes and mouth softened by the pain she felt, not just from the burns but from the injustice of what had transpired. She reached for the towel dispenser, her hands trembling as she wiped the water from her face, trying to compose herself. The burns on her arms were already beginning to swell, angry red marks where the hot water had struck. The sharp pain was a constant reminder of how much she had just lost, not only physically but emotionally. But it was the pill bottle that truly broke her. Her heart sank when she glanced down at the small plastic container now soaked through. The label was peeling away, the ink smudged from the water. She could feel her pulse quicken as she gingerly picked up the bottle. The smell that wafted from it was not the familiar scent of her medication, but something acrid, dissolved and ruined. She opened the bottle with trembling hands, praying that the pills inside had not been completely destroyed. But her hopes were dashed. Most of the tablets had disintegrated, their fragile forms turned into a pasty mess at the bottom of the bottle. A single pill remained, barely intact, still holding its shape but wet and imperfect. It was the only hope she had, and Maddie's heart clenched as she realized what this meant. This medication wasn't just important, it was essential to her survival. Without it, her body would descend into a dangerous crisis. The thin film of hope that had carried her through the morning had just shattered. Maddie felt a wave of panic surge through her chest as the reality of the situation set in. She had budgeted for this medication, set aside every penny she could spare, knowing that this was the one thing she couldn't afford to lose. And now, because of one man's cruelty, it was all slipping away from her. The life-saving medication she had relied on for years was ruined, wasted in an instant. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she reached for the pill, her hands still trembling violently. She stared at it, the small white tablet that held the key to whether she would stay conscious or slip into an Addisonian crisis. Her body needed it. She needed it. But the thought of swallowing a pill that had been dampened by the spilled water, that had absorbed the scalding heat, made her stomach turn. She couldn't risk it. But there was no choice. Maddie had lived with her disease long enough to know that sometimes survival didn't give you a second chance. With a deep breath, she forced the pill into her mouth, dry, desperate, and choking slightly as it scraped down her throat. Her chest tightened as she gulped down water from the faucet, trying to push it down, trying to make it work. She was barely able to keep her head above the overwhelming tide of panic that threatened to drown her. She had faced adversity before, but this felt like too much. Her body was betraying her. The world outside was hostile, and here she was, reduced to swallowing a single damp pill just to keep herself alive. For a moment she stood there, hands pressed against the sink, her face pale and streaked with tears. But as the dizziness began to ease slightly, as the tremors in her hands began to settle, Maddie straightened her back. She had been knocked down, humiliated, and wounded. But she would not stay there. She had never stayed down, and she wouldn't start now. With a deep breath, Maddie wiped the remaining tears from her face, straightened her sweater as best she could, and took one last look at her reflection. What she saw was a woman battered by life, but still standing, still fighting. She could face the world outside. She had to. As Maddie made her way through the restroom door, Michael Jordan sat quietly in the far corner of the cafe, his presence almost invisible in the midst of the unfolding chaos. He had come to the cafe seeking a rare moment of quiet. The world, with all its noise and its demands, was often too much for him, even for a man who had conquered arenas, broken records, and defied expectations at every turn. He had learned that peace, true peace, was hard to come by, and sometimes the best way to find it was in places like this, a cafe where the hum of the city outside blended with the soft jazz playing in the background, where the most important thing was a warm drink and the simple act of being present. But today his peace had been shattered. He had been sitting by the window, his gaze turned inward as he sipped his coffee, lost in thought. His eyes had briefly flicked to the entrance as Maddie had walked in, her age apparent in the way she moved, her steps slow but deliberate. There was something about her that seemed to resonate with him. She had the quiet dignity of someone who had lived through many storms, yet continued to stand tall. But when she had been confronted by the cafe's owner, Whitaker, Michael had felt his blood run cold. The words that had come from Whitaker's mouth, those venomous, degrading words, struck him like a punch to the gut. He had seen injustice before, but this felt personal, as if Whitaker was attacking something deeper than just Maddie. He was attacking her very humanity, reducing her to an inconvenience, a nuisance, because of who she was. Michael's gaze had locked onto the scene with an intensity that was almost painful. He had seen many things in his life: victory, failure, the hunger of competition, and the triumph of the human spirit. But there was something about this moment, about the cruelty in Whitaker's eyes, that made his stomach churn. His instincts, honed over years of competitive play and personal struggle, told him to act. He knew the power of standing up when it mattered most, the weight of doing what was right no matter the cost. And as he watched Whitaker pour hot water on Maddie, literally and metaphorically, the sense of urgency grew inside him. He was no longer a passive observer. His breath had quickened, his pulse had sped up, and his body had tensed as though he were about to step onto a court to defend against an impossible shot. The injustice before him ignited something deep inside, a need to protect, to intervene. As Maddie's cry of pain filled the room, Michael's heart broke. He could feel her suffering in his bones, as though the cruel act had been done to him. He could feel the weight of her humiliation, the violation of her dignity. And in that instant, something inside him clicked. He couldn't sit there and watch this unfold. He had witnessed the indomitable strength of the human spirit countless times, but seeing it tested in this way stirred something in him that he could not ignore. The cafe had fallen into stunned silence, and it was only now that Michael truly understood the weight of the silence around him. It wasn't the silence of disbelief. It was the silence of complicity. The other patrons had not spoken up. They had turned away, unwilling to step into the fray, unwilling to break the quiet. But Michael couldn't stay silent. He wasn't a man who simply watched injustice unfold. He had been raised to confront it. As Maddie slowly got to her feet, her steps unsteady and her hands trembling, Michael knew that he had to act. The tears that welled in her eyes, the humiliation she felt as she walked away from the table, it all hit him like a wave. This wasn't just a random act of cruelty. It was a systematic dehumanization, the kind that had plagued society for generations. As Maddie entered the restroom, Michael stood up, his chair scraping against the floor with a sharp, deliberate sound that broke the stillness. His presence loomed large in the café now, and for the first time since the incident began, the other patrons seemed to notice him. Not as the former basketball legend, but as a man who understood the weight of this moment. His steps were purposeful as he moved toward the counter, his gaze fixed firmly on Whitaker. "Hey, Whitaker!" Michael's voice cut through the air, clear and unwavering. The cafe owner turned, his eyes widening slightly at the unexpected intrusion. But Michael wasn't interested in his surprise. He was focused solely on the man who had tried to break Maddie, who had humiliated her in front of everyone in that room. "You don't treat people like that," Michael said, his voice calm but firm, a stark contrast to the angry fire burning inside him. "You don't ever treat someone like that. Not in here. Not anywhere." Whitaker sneered, clearly unafraid, but Michael's stature and presence commanded a different kind of attention now. The air between them thickened. "I don't know who you think you are, but that woman, Maddie, deserves respect," Michael continued. "You may have the money, the power, the establishment, but you don't have the decency. You don't get to strip someone's dignity away because it doesn't fit your idea of what belongs here." Whitaker's face hardened, but Michael didn't flinch. He knew that this wasn't just about standing up for Maddie. This was about sending a message to anyone who would watch and let such cruelty continue unchecked. The room was silent, each person in the cafe watching with a mix of awe and discomfort. But the truth had been spoken, and it hung in the air like a heavy weight. Michael Jordan, a man who had faced countless pressures and challenges in his life, was now fighting for something even more fundamental: human dignity. As Michael stood his ground, his eyes never leaving Whitaker's, he realized that sometimes the most important victories weren't the ones fought on the court. Sometimes the battles that truly mattered were those fought in moments like this, when courage was required not to win, but to do what was right. As Maddie stood in the face of injustice, her resilience spoke louder than words ever could. In a world where cruelty and prejudice still exist, it's important for us to stand up, to be the voice for those who may not have one, and to bring awareness to the struggles we all share as human beings. If you felt moved by Maddie's story, if her courage inspired you, I encourage you to take a moment to subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you'll be a part of a community that believes in spreading compassion, justice, and understanding. And we want to hear from you. Comment below and let us know your thoughts on the story, how it impacted you, what you think about standing up for others, and how we can all make a difference in the world around us. Your voice matters. Let's keep this conversation going. Together we can make the world a better, more compassionate place for everyone.